everybody, welcome to What the Flick. Tim, Bibbs, Alonso, Young Pope Episode 2, the second episode. That's what they're called, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's simple. I like it.
So the Pope gives a homily.
What the what?
Finally.
Holy, whoa.
So much
It's
discussion.
like The Walking Dead up in this piece.
So much discussion of the homily in Episode 1. We get one, and I told you it was going to be a doozy.
It is one heck of a doozy, isn't
Yeah.
it? Like we saw in the opening episode, his dream about what sort of shocking homily could he give? How could he mess with the world? And then instead, God, it's a
180s.
nightmare.
Yeah.
It's an absolute horrifying nightmare. Like this is like how people are afraid like Trump is going to address the nation tomorrow.
It's like Pope Oliver Cromwell or something.
Like it's a worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Like because we've been toying with, even in this episode, the idea that maybe he has a capacity for goodness. That whole bit with the kangaroo was surprisingly sensitive and sweet and kind of beautiful. And then he turns around and he does this crap.
He's either really, really complicated or I really haven't figured out which the real Lenny Baldano is yet. Because we see so many different aspects. Him with, in front of everyone in the square, and him with his mentor groveling and servile, and him with the power play against Sister Mary, but then turning around and going back and talking to her about his parents.
Well, he's clearly grappling with his fate, and I had forgotten about the scene with the parents. So I guess maybe she's not his mother after all,
or maybe maybe he just doesn't know.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
We'll leave that one open. But
The scene with Andrew, the other orphan, kind of seals up that she takes in orphans. She raises.
Well,
them.
yeah, I got the impression that they were closer than that. But whatever.
And she tells him, don't call me Sister Mary, call me Ma. So it's like, oh, what are you blowing my mind?
But that
Diane
was.
Keaton?
But wasn't that a dream?
No. That's a
that was an
flashback to
actual
the other
flashback?
kid.
I
yeah.
thought that was a dream. Like, okay.
No. So he's clearly unsure about the existence of God and his own capacity to judge, and so it's telling that the only thing that he brings with him when he's delivering the homily is the letter from the kid in Texas who wants to know where to find God because he doesn't know either, obviously, and rather than cop to that in any way, he has to sort of double down on the being godlier than everybody else, even if that becomes this sort of cruel thing, which doubled with the faceless Pope idea becomes even more terrifying. Because in the speech that he has with Cécile de France, who, not Ludivine Sagna, I got her wrong last week.
Yes.
The notion of the faceless Pope, being like Daft Punk is brilliant. Like marketing-wise, that's a great idea. But then when Shadow Pope gives that homily, it's like, oh shit.
Yeah, it's like an evil Wizard of Oz.
Totally.
All of a sudden. It's interesting that you took that interpretation of him taking that child's letter and then not feeling the presence of God himself and doubling down on knowledge he doesn't actually have. Because what I took away from that was the idea that he looked at that letter, and we looked at that letter as well, and I think we sort of projected a little bit because he's really inscrutable a lot of the time. And we said to himself, oh, that's actually kind of a sweet letter. I'll take that with me. And I just thought his interpretation was, to hell with that kid. That kid sucks. Like he totally says he doesn't like tourists.
Right.
Like he's mad at people if they're not like good Catholics in a way, but like of course there's an enormous amount of hypocrisy.
Well,
to that.
I read it as all projection. He's
Okay.
having his own crisis of
Yes.
faith, so then he accuses everyone else in the world of having a crisis.
I think we're kind of saying the same thing because
I can't find God. You've clearly forgotten where God is.
he's basically he's like every super right-wing anti-gay senator who gets caught in a men's room.
Right.
So it's like he's taking his own doubts about God and basically, having to be super godly and, overdoing his performance of belief and judging everyone else for having the doubts that he in fact is harboring.
I look at this show and the way people talk about God and the absence of God and how they feel about their belief in God. And there's a part of me, because it's Paolo Sorrentino, who is not necessarily a subtle filmmaker a lot at the time. I wonder if this is going to be like the third man, and like at the end of the season, God will show up. And he's just
On a Ferris wheel.
Yeah, on a Ferris wheel, something, Like I wonder how far we're going to go with this crisis of faith, because again, they've announced there's going to be a season 2. So the story will continue.
Yeah.
In one form or another, regardless of how Lenny turns out. And if you're going to do that idea, if you're going to address that crisis of faith, we're kind of used to that being sort of presented in a rather neat and tidy narrative. Someone has a crisis of faith, they find their faith again at the end of the movie, for example. That's rather common. any Kirk Cameron movie to speak of, except for maybe Saving Christmas. Although no, even then, because there's the other guy. It's just not Kirk Cameron who does it. Okay, there you go. Like that's the conventional narrative.
Sure.
There even talks about like there's that idea in a lot of stories about faith that he's not really an atheist. He kind of believes in God. He just doesn't like God.
Yes.
You know, so there's that as well. Are you really a non-believer if you're just pissed? There's that topic as well. I'm curious how we're going to span this over a long narrative. Is he going to come to a variety of different conclusions and change repeatedly, or is he just going to be this chaotic force that everyone around him has to constantly respond to?
Well, I mean, obviously Voyello is going to be the rock in his espadrille, you know, and while Voyello's intentions are very worldly in a lot of ways because they're about wealth and power, he is probably more legitimately a believer than Lenny is, and so that conflict between the sacred and the profane and the worldly and the spiritual, I think, is going to sort of play out between the two of them, and find a middle ground that where one might argue that the middle ground is where that modern Catholic Church exists anyway.
Well, if you look at this story as an analog for politics as well, which I think is fair, you look here again at an outsider who maybe isn't qualified to be doing what they're doing, shaking up the system regardless of who it destroys. And who is the counterpoint to that? Well, they're a career politician.
Right.
Someone whose heart is in the right place. They went into public service for noble causes. But Voyello also has been around long enough that he acknowledges that there's a lot of elements of the system that are corrupting, that are difficult, that don't necessarily sound great, but must be done for the greater good. And he seems so, what's the word? Tainted. But he's tainted by everyday stuff. That's just the natural extension of the job.
The establishment has problems, but setting everything on fire isn't necessarily the answer to those problems.
Exactly.
And sometimes we just might prefer the establishment to everything
what being a nicely topical show.
Being a smoldering wreck, you know,
there
just
was
a thought.
There was a big theme of balance in this episode particularly. They kept saying that Voyello's address was very balanced and even-handed, and that goes in to show what sort of spiritual leader he is. Yes, he is very political, he's very diplomatic, but he's also very devout, as seen with his attending to this handicapped child and sort of using that time as confession and penance, taking care of this kid. And then we see that the Pope is very much the pendulum swing in both directions around Voyello. At times way more conservative and way more Old Testament, and at times way more modern and way more savvy, and so he's a very unbalanced character.
Well, you say that, but I think the Old Testament is in its sharpness, in its directness, in how simple it is. Bad, abomination, bad. There's a certain what's the word I'm looking for? It's very allegorical. It's very just straight. I think it does fit sort of modern marketing in a lot of ways. The idea of just leading by divine right that's not very Christian, and that's not really what Christ said.
Well, yeah, and the idea of the Pope is that he is supposed to be the fisherman, the rock on which, you know, Jesus builds his church. That the New Testament is supposed to sort of undo some of the harshness of the Old Testament. But, you know, the Old Testament's always sort of lying there, you know, to be dipped into at convenient moments. You brought up Paolo Sorrentino, and I did want to talk a little about just his general style in terms of you can't really talk about him without talking about Fellini, you know, because obviously, you know, the Great Beauty, you know, kind of touches on themes from Roma and La Dolce Vita. Youth kind of gets into some 8.5 territory.
I see Great Beauty as a little bit of 8.5 as well, but like, yeah, Sorrentino is to Fellini what like De Palma is to Hitchcock.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so, you know, we had, you know, somebody on Twitter pointed out there were shots from this that seemed to be out of Satyricon, which I've been really not seen. But I know that like Roma, for instance, has that ecclesiastical fashion show, you know, and which sort of ties into, there is kind of a running joke about the coexistence of, again, the sacred and the profane. So where like you'll have these people sort of decked out in their cardinals outfits, but smoking, or smoking and hitting the oxygen mask, or on an iPad, or the nuns who are playing soccer,
Sure.
like that kind of thing. And so he's touching onto those areas of like, oh, the clergy are people too,
Well, there's just the lavish production design on the show, and again, it takes place in the Vatican, a place that isn't necessarily known for being like a ramshackle shack.
Right, and they clearly couldn't shoot there, so I'm sure they had to fake the Vatican, which is even harder.
But they're creating that sense of opulence, these incredible works of architecture and painting and statues that were created to exalt God, the divine, everything amazing here. And when you have characters who are hidden from the world, but in a place that is basically just screaming out, this is God's house. Like if God existed and God had an ego, he'd live here. You get that sense of divide. You get that sense that maybe these people are well-intentioned, but they're sort of hiding out, and maybe they're not necessarily. We have a few glimpses of people outside of the Vatican, just Catholics.
Yeah, and
it's an entirely different experience.
And the cardinal who was his sort of brother, from the orphanage, like he's itching to get back to Africa to do his missionary work and not sort of sit around and wait for the Pope to give his address. And frankly, I think if the Pope really wanted to shake stuff up, he would talk about, selling the art treasures and feeding the poor with the money, but no one ever wants to go there.
No, let's not go nuts.
No, please.
No, we're not stupid.
Heavens.
Yeah, like
So yeah, this show is it's a bit of a slow burn. You can tell this is not traditional American television. And I think in terms of how it's unfolding and the pacing of it,
Anything else we want to?
Yeah,
you have notes.
Do you want to touch on the plot at all?
Oh, why not?
Did we not? Okay, go ahead.
Well,
Sorry.
I mean,
we talked about the marketing and we talked about the homily,
right?
And the kangaroo.
The scene with the mentor.
With
Gutierrez is calling
James
to the
Cromwell.
faith at the Vatican. I also I thought the scene with the head of the clergy, where he has his little interview asking if
that's which at first I was like, what's this about? And then you realize he's just trying to find any excuse to get rid of him to put James Cromwell in that position.
Yeah.
So, which begs a larger question, like what does he really want to do with his mentor, Spencer? Because it seems like Spencer wants to be his adversary, wants to take him down, wants to replace him.
Right.
Godfather.
Okay.
Keep your friends closer and your enemies closer.
Right.
Like if he's right there, he's not necessarily out in the world creating
Plotting against him.
Creating an opposition.
And
Do
I'm
you
sure
read the same way into Sister Mary then? Do you?
Not quite, because I get the impression that she's kind of a crutch for him.
Okay.
Like he actually he's like the one thing he kind of needs.
So,
Whether or not he'll be
they're
nice to her all
replacing
the
his
time.
parents, but in totally different ways.
Kind of, yeah. He is putting his
True,
parents
they are
in the house with him.
surrogate father, surrogate mother, and I think that if there's a sense of guilt of like, oh God, I got this gig and not my mentor, like the least I can do is give him some plum position in my in my cabinet. Whatever.
I find myself wondering if he's capable of guilt. I find myself wondering
True.
because it's a sort of thing where I'm not saying he is a sociopath, but he has sociopathic tendencies.
Sure.
He is whatever the room needs him to be
Yeah.
at the moment, and if what that is and as the Pope, it's going to happen a lot, allows him to be all powerful and commanding and absolutely in control. Great. If he needs to be something else, he will always be that thing. So I don't know who he is. I don't know how to trust him, and that makes him fascinating because you put him in the rigid confines of a strictly dogmatic culture, society, and put him in charge of it. So that's fascinating. But I don't know who he is yet. I don't know if he's evil, good, misguided. I don't know.
It's like literally the one job on the earth where you have ultimate power and you're supposed to have all of the answers. Everyone else in the world is turning to you for answers.
Right.
And you're the one guy that doesn't have
It's kind of the flip side of Damien Thorne becoming president of the United States in Omen 3.
Nice. Good reference. I like it.
Anything else? Did we leave out?
No, that's probably enough for
Okay, good.
Okay. All right. Well, so we'll be back Monday with episode 3. Thanks for watching.